Hi everyone, and welcome to this lesson on explanations of obedience. You'll need your social psychology booklet out and available to you, open to page 21. So before we get going with the actual explanations of obedience, we need to just start with a general definition, and I'll give you a bit of background in terms of where these theories came from. So obedience, I'm sure you're already aware, is following orders from those that we perceive to be in a position of power and authority. So if you want to just get that written in on page 21 of your booklet. So it's following orders from those that we perceive to be in positions of power and authority. Also, in there, you might want to put some examples of the people that you follow orders from. So, for example, we regularly follow orders from the police, from doctors, from government bodies, from teachers, anybody within the education system, from managers, members of the military, etc. Okay, so anybody who operates within an organisation or an institution, they tend to be the people that we are obedient to. Now, what's interesting in psychology, when what we know about obedience, is that most obedience in society is good obedience. So you can see at the bottom of page 21, the space for you to note down some good examples of obedience. The people that I've just listed there, so teachers and doctors and the police, they are all responsible for kind of upholding society in some way, shape, or form. So, following orders from a doctor, we trust those people because they're going to make us better. So, an example of good obedience is following instructions from a doctor, for example, to take medication, as we assume that that's going to make us better. Another good example, all right, would be following an instruction from a police officer. For example, telling them telling us to stand somewhere in particular. We trust that order. We think that it's there for a reason. That's a good example of obedience, or an example of good obedience, in that it maintains order. Bad obedience, however, or destructive obedience, to give it its proper term, is where we're following orders to do things that hurt other people, okay? They go against what we think or what we know is right. They are often immoral actions. They cause us guilt. They cause us to feel regret and remorse after we have done it. Yet sometimes we are trapped in situations that make us blindly follow those orders, and we do commit acts of destructive obedience. So, for example, in your booklet, we might want to say things like soldiers at times of war. They're often doing things that they don't want to do. They're hurting or harming people that otherwise they wouldn't ordinarily do. But they're following orders, they're following instructions. They probably regret some of the things that they do. But that is an example of bad obedience or destructive obedience. Another good one would be members of gangs, following orders from people who are higher up in the hierarchy in a gang to hurt another member. Bullying people just because you've been told to do so by somebody in your friendship group who's perceived as having more status than you. So, destructive obedience is unfortunately all around us, just as much as good obedience is. And it's destructive obedience that Stanley Milgram was mainly interested in. Now, when I'm explaining obedience to you, you will see that it's divided into two separate theories. The first theory that we're going to look at is the situational explanations of obedience. Now, these are arguing, as you can see there on the screen, that acts of destructive obedience are not due to the person's personality. People are not inherently evil. The amount of people in society who are truly evil, and it is something about their character, is actually really rare. Milgram firmly believed that anybody, nice as you like, trapped in the wrong situation, is capable of committing acts of destructive obedience and harming other individuals. So he very much speaks about the power of the situation. This is a situational explanation of why we are obedient. So grab a highlighter for me, please, and just make sure that that stands out in your booklet on page 30. This first explanation from Milgram is a situational explanation of obedience. Now, the first thing that I need to just do very briefly is introduce you to Milgram's key terminology. Now, Milgram argues that the vast majority of the time, human beings are in one of two states of human consciousness. They are either in what he calls the autonomous state, where we have free will, we are responsible for our actions, we are in control of what we are doing. And then there is this secondary state, which we actually find ourselves in more often than what we probably would like to think. This is called the agentic state, where we have surrendered all of our responsibility and we are literally just doing what we are told. We have become an agent of someone else. We are in a situation where we're assuming that there's somebody there that knows what they are doing and that we should just follow their orders. So Milgram argues that we go between these two stages in something that he called the agentic shift, okay? Now, I want you to just kind of think about where you were this morning. In which of those states were you in this morning? If you were truly autonomous, then you woke up when you wanted to wake up. You decided that you were going to get up, you were going to get washed, etc., etc. If you got up because you had to be at college for a certain time, or if your parents woke you up, or if you woke up to an alarm, then already you are in the agentic state. You have gone through what he called the agentic shift. You have surrendered all free will and all autonomy, and you are following the rules of society or that situation. So being in the agentic state is very, very trapping, and we don't realize that we are in that situation a lot of the time. So these are two key ideas that Milgram speaks about heavily in his situational explanation of obedience. What makes the agentic shift occur, and what is the difference between these autonomous and agentic states? So that's what we're going to try and explain now, okay? What sends us into these two states and what forces the agentic shift? So let's take a closer look. Now, what you are going to write into your booklet on page 30 is this gap fill, okay? You're going to have to take a few moments, obviously, to pause the video and get this popped in. I would like you to see if you can figure out what goes into some of these spaces initially on your own, okay, based on what I've just said, but there will be a word bank that comes up in a second. So pause this here, okay, have a look over the words, start writing the gap fill into your booklet, and then I will put up a word bank in a couple of minutes. So off you go, pause that, see if you can figure out what goes in there. Okay. So hopefully you've been able to figure out most of those. We'll now just go through the answers. And apologies, there is an error just in that word bank. I've just noticed it. So according to Milgram, individuals have two states of consciousness which they can switch between depending on the situation. These are called autonomous and agentic. In the autonomous state, the individual is aware of the consequences of their actions and takes personal responsibility for them. I would like you, please, to highlight that section that we've just read. That in the autonomous state, we are in control, we are aware of the consequences, and we take responsibility. We're doing what we want to do. We are making our own independent decisions. In the agentic state, on the other hand, the individual sees themselves as being an agent of someone else, and that this person, and not themselves, is responsible for any consequences. An individual is more likely to obey when they have moved from being in the autonomous state into the agentic state. And as we've already said, this move is called the agentic shift. The shift into an agentic and obedient state happens in situations where we feel we are no longer responsible for our actions because, quite simply, we are in the presence of authority. We trust them, we trust their definition of the situation, and we surrender all free will and we will do what we are told. So that is the two states of consciousness, agentic and autonomous. We're now going to turn our attention to what forces us through the agentic shift. However, I'd like you to add something into your booklet, because when students are writing a 16 mark on this, if they just do two separate paragraphs on the agentic state and legitimacy of authority, it can feel a little bit disjointed. So I would like you to take a moment now just to copy this sentence into your booklet in the space between paragraph 1 and paragraph 2, because it just fastens them together. So Milgram believed that the presence of certain situational factors could force someone to experience an agentic shift, for example, and then we're going to go into legitimate authority. So again, pause it here, take a second to write that sentence in, please. Okay, so now then, we're going to take a look at legitimate authority. And we have spoke about this already when we were doing the variations of Milgram. We definitely mentioned this. So take another couple of minutes, pause it here, see if you can figure out what goes in those words, and then I'll put the word bank up, see if that helps you out a little bit. So pause here, please, take a look at them. Can you figure any out? I'm just adding on the word bank now at this point. Does that help you with any of those terms? And let's go through the right answers. So we've said that legitimate authority often creates the agentic shift. It pushes us into the agentic state. So we now just need to describe what it actually is. So people are more likely to obey an order if it is coming from someone who they perceive or think is in a position of genuine authority. So society, because of how it's structured, gives power and status to certain individuals, such as doctors, police, and teachers. These people sit higher in society's hierarchy than others. We're all introduced to that hierarchy at a very young age. And we are just seen as people, seeing those people as in positions of power and control, but only in certain situations or settings. So again, if you want to grab your highlighter, that's really important. So society does give these individuals power and status, but that only is trapped within a certain situation. So for example, my authority only goes as far as the four walls of college, okay? Outside of that environment, I have no authority to ask people to do what I want them to do. I wouldn't be able to give people instruction and expect them to follow it. So yes, I have authority and power and status over you guys, but only in the classroom situation. So, by and large, authority figures must be part of some sort of institutional structure. So, we've said the education system, but we would also mention the military or business organisations, such as your managers in your jobs. Individuals are socialised, so raised from a very, very young age to have unquestionable respect and trust for anybody who is above them in terms of that hierarchy. We accept their definition of the situation and we trust what they are saying to us. It makes it easier for us to obey them if we think they know what they are doing, as when Milgram's experimenter reassured the teacher that the learner wasn't in danger. They trusted them because they believed that they were in a position of authority. So that's legitimate authority, and as I've said, that is a situational factor that causes us to move through the agentic shift and puts us into the agentic state. So that, guys, is the description of the situational explanation of obedience. We're now going to take a look at the opposing argument. Now, you might be wondering, why are we just kind of skipping over the evaluation? It's because I describe both of these theories together and then we evaluate them side by side. Because most of the questions in this area are discuss one or more or discuss both explanations of obedience. So now we're going to turn our attention away from situational explanations of obedience and onto the idea that it might actually be something in your personality. Keep your booklets where they are for the moment. Don't go any further forward. Okay. So the dispositional explanation of Obedience on this occasion is known as the authoritarian personality. Okay, so whenever I use the word now going forward, dispositional explanation, I'm talking about a personality trait. And some individuals believe that you can have a cluster of authoritarian traits that make us more likely to be obedient. Those cluster of traits were originally measured by something called the F scale. Now, the F scale was originally created around about World War II, and it was actually used as a measure of fascism. So, whether or not individuals were tolerant to kind of rigid structures in society, were they prejudiced, were they discriminating against kind of minority groups? It is still used today, though, however, to monitor authoritarian personality and just simply the levels of obedience that you show. So in the assignment, I've sent you a link to a test, okay? That test is a version of the F scale. I want you to take your time with it. Some of the questions are unclear. They are a little bit confusing because it is really quite old now. But do your best with it and see what score you come out with. So pause this here, go back to the link, take the test now, and see whether or not you are more or less obedient than the average person. Now, what that should have given you, what that should have generated, is a series of scores in terms of different dimensions and different criteria that you might have. So if you look back at what your overall score was, it'll say whether or not you've got high levels of authoritarian submission, for example. That's, do you give in to authority figures on a regular basis? Do you have high levels of authoritarian aggression, for example? Do you feel that people should just do what they are told? And do you get a little bit frustrated, for example, when people aren't doing that? So have a look at your overall dimensions. Are you more or less obedient or more or less authoritarian, to use its proper term, than the average individual? Now, if we pop all that kind of to one side, and we're now going to turn our attention to where does this personality style come from? Why do you end up with an authoritarian personality? I've definitely got one, and I'm sure that some of you will have one as well. So, why do we end up with this style of personality? Now, what I can tell you is that a lot of the authoritarian personality explanation has got roots in psychodynamics and humanism. So, when we're explaining the origins of this personality style, i.e., where it comes from, some of the concepts from humanism and psychodynamics are actually relevant here. So, all I'm going to do is pose you an answer. And all I want you to do is just take a few moments to engage with this activity and see if you can latch this onto any element from either psychodynamics or humanism. Okay. Do you know enough about those approaches to make sense? Of this personality dimension. So, what do you think the question is if I'm posing this as an answer? Okay, so the answer is characterized by strict levels of discipline and fathers who are critical of failure. So, what do you think the question would have been? How does that relate to psychodynamics or humanism? Okay. So, with this statement, this is asking us about the type of upbringing or type of childhood that these people might have experienced. So, their upbringing was characterized by strict levels of discipline and fathers who are critical of failure. So, again, think back to your score. Were you higher on average than most people? All right, were you more authoritarian? Does that ring true to your upbringing, your childhood? Okay. Was there strict levels of discipline? And was your father potentially critical of any failure? So that relates to psychodynamics, arguing that adult personality style is a product of the way that you've been brought up, okay, your upbringing. Next statement. So if this is the answer, what question do you think I've posed here? So they include the belief that in order to receive love and affection from your parents, you have to be obedient. So what is it, do you think, that I'm talking about there? What concept from either psychodynamics or humanism do you think I'm referring to? They include the belief that to receive love and affection, they have to be obedient. I'm hoping that you've been able to spot that that's reference to conditions of worth or conditional positive regard. So making a child believe that in order to get love and affection from their parents or from teachers as well, that they have to be obedient. So we've got elements of humanistic psychology in there as well. They have had conditions of worth imposed onto them from a very, very young age. Final one. This states displacement of resentment and hostility onto weaker targets. What's the question? What element of psychodynamics and humanism do you think that is in relation to? So my question with point number 3 would have likely been, what defense mechanism do those with authoritarian personality use? And the answer is displacement, and they take any resentment and hostility that they feel towards maybe their father figure and displace it onto weaker targets. Thus, we get those criteria of authoritarian personality, like authoritarian aggression. So well done if you managed to come up with some answers for those. We're now going to start taking a look at our booklet. We've introduced the concept, we've completed the scale. You now need to go forward to your booklet on page 33, okay? So, as I've already said to you, authoritarian personality is a dispositional explanation, okay? And it refers to someone's personality type rather than the situation. We've said already, if you want to just highlight it in your booklet, that it's measured by the F scale, originally created mid kind of 40s to indicate what level of fascism somebody was showing. And a score of over 4.5 meant that somebody possesses some, but not all, authoritarian traits, and is thus more likely to be obedient, okay? Now, at the bottom of page 33, you can see there's the information which we've just been through there. What are the origins of an authoritarian personality? Where does it find its roots? So we've got reference to the conditions of worth being imposed onto them. We've got reference to a particularly strict upbringing, and we've got reference to potential use of defense mechanisms, including displacement as well. Now, in the exam, you would need to actually refer to those 3 dimensions that make up the authoritarian personality, and they are conventionalism, authoritarian submission, and authoritarian aggression. Now, we can ignore the task on the right-hand side. We don't need to list an item from the F scale. We're never going to get round to doing that in the exam. So we can box off that final column. But what we do need is a definition of each of the components. So take a moment to pause this here and copy them in, and then I'll just explain what they are. So pause here, fill in page 34. Okay. So conventionalism is really, really straightforward. Are you conventional in your views of society? Do you accept that there is a hierarchy in society and that everybody should follow it? Most of us have got a degree of conventionalism. If you've got higher levels of that dimension, then obviously you're more authoritarian. So you believe in order to keep structure in society, there's got to be a hierarchy. If we were all equal to one another, then it would be carnage. Authoritarian submission is the idea that you have to do as you are told by authority figures, and you will largely blindly be obedient. So authoritarian submission, which I'm almost certain will be a high dimension for some of you, is that you genuinely believe that there are people in society that you are just supposed to do as you are told by. And then lastly, authoritarian aggression is where we have the tendency to get angry or frustrated at people who don't follow authority, okay? So think about yourself in a classroom setting. how do you feel when somebody is not doing what they are told? When somebody is purposely kind of causing disruption? Do you think you have a touch of authoritarian aggression? Is it kind of frustrating for you to see that? Do you blindly follow what the police are telling you to do? And anybody who challenges the police, does that cause you frustration as well? Because you just think they are a position of authority, we're supposed to do what we're told by them. So that's authoritarian aggression. So we need to know each of those three for the exam: conventionalism, authoritarian submission, and authoritarian aggression. The last thing that we need to know about is where kind of this personality style comes from. So we're going to fill in the little gap fill at the bottom of page 34. But I do just want to point out a couple of things to you before you do this. Can you all add into your booklet somewhere on the bottom of that page that what I'm about to describe to you does not mean that these people have been abused in their childhood, okay? Just because we're saying that they've had a strict upbringing, that doesn't mean that they have been abused, all right? Parents can use discipline in a variety of ways. It isn't always to that kind of level. Also, this shouldn't be the focus of your answer. The focus of your answer should be those authoritarian characteristics, okay? Do that first and then lead into this, okay? So I'm hoping that you're able to fill in those gaps. I think they are pretty straightforward. So if you want to just pause this here, okay? Pause this here and have a go at popping those in, and then I'll go for the answers in a second. So pause here. Okay, so the correct answers are: have usually had a strict upbringing by parents who demanded obedience and used physical punishment. Fear and respect those in authority and unquestioningly obey them. They are prejudiced against those minority groups whom they feel are weak and inferior to them. They believe that society is deteriorating and that we need strong leaders to rectify this. And they are quite rigid and inflexible in their views, believing that everything is either right or wrong and there is no in between or grey areas. Okay. So I want you to put that to one side for the moment, and I want you to have a go at doing this exam question for me. Now, some of you have got this on a sheet that I provided in lesson. Others are just going to have to write this out for me. So if you do have the sheet, then you can go ahead and try to start answering that. If you don't, pause it here and just write out the scenario for me. Okay. Okay, so this question says, Lena is finding it difficult to work with her new colleague, Jordan. Jordan often questions management decisions and prefers a more relaxed approach to workplace rules. Lena believes that rules are there for a reason, should always be followed without question. She becomes frustrated when Jordan challenges authority and ignores traditional expectations about workplace roles, and she feels that people like him undermine respect and discipline. For 4 marks, using your knowledge of the authoritarian personality, explain Lena's attitudes towards her colleagues. Okay, so again, pause this here. Take you about 5 minutes to answer that question. Off you go, guys. Okie doke. So we're now just going to take a look at the mark scheme, and obviously it's wanting reference to those 3 criteria or dimensions. Lena obviously is showing authoritarian submission. She believes that management should be followed without question, and that suggests that she's got strong respect for authority. She's got authoritarian aggression because she becomes frustrated and maybe hostile towards Jordan when he's breaking those workplace norms and kind of challenging the authority figures. And she's also conventional. She's got a preference for traditional workplace roles and values and believe that everybody has got their position. So give yourself a mark out of 4. If you want to adjust or amend your answer, that's absolutely fine. Make sure you bring these into lesson after the half-term break. So now then, what we need to do is have a look at the evaluation points, okay? So we're going to go back initially and have a look at the situational explanation of obedience. So we need to flick back in your booklets, please, to page 31. All right. Just going to pop this up. Just flick through this. Okay, so page 31 in your booklet, we've got the evaluation points that go with the situational explanations of obedience, okay? So, first and foremost, there is supportive lab experiment evidence for Milgram's situational factors and the role that they play in obedience. So we've obviously got reference to Bridgeport, if you want to just highlight that in your booklets on page 31. This is a variation that you should all already be familiar with. We know that in the Bridgeport variation, so location, obedience dropped down to 48%. We also know in the uniform variation, when the experimenter was no longer wearing the white lab coat, that obedience dropped right the way down to 20%. This shows us, therefore, that legitimacy of authority is the most powerful factor causing obedience. If you remember when I taught you those variations, the uniform variation was not what you expected to create the biggest drop. You all thought it would be proximity. The lack of the lab coat shows how powerful legitimate authority is, okay? So it drops all the way down to 20. They lacked trust, okay? They didn't think that the experimenter was legitimate. Also, in Milgram's study, the participants often refused to continue administering the shocks and simply asked the question, who's responsible for that man in there? Okay, so they wanted reassurance from the experimenter that this wasn't their fault. They were following an order and that the person giving the order should be responsible for it. So when they were told that the experimenter was indeed taking responsibility, they continued. As soon as they were told, you are not responsible for this, they went ahead and did it anyway. That therefore shows us the agentic state is real and it is powerful, okay? We've got an additional variation there that you might want to highlight if you're going for the higher grades. When the teacher was instructed to only read the questions and the shocks were given by someone else, obedience actually increased to 93%. So when they were not actually administering the shocks, they were perfectly fine in terms of giving the order to someone else to continue up to 450 volts. So 93% when they were fully in the agentic state and they weren't accepting any responsibility. So this obviously means that situational explanations can be accepted as a valid explanation for obedience. Further to that, we've got several real-life examples of war crimes that can demonstrate how people become submissive to positions of authority. Now, I started off this whole topic by introducing you to the idea of Adolf Eichmann during the Holocaust. So Adolf Eichmann was dubbed the architect of the Holocaust because he came up with all of the kind of plans, laid the plans for the concentration camps and how the Nazi Party were going to murder basically millions of people in that act of genocide. So he was, as it says there, the kind of leader of that. He was the architect of the Holocaust, and it was his ideas that ultimately led to millions of deaths. Now, when he was captured, and he was one of the only Nazi Party that were captured, or the senior Nazi officials that was captured, when he was captured and he was put on trial, and his trial was kind of televised for the whole world to see, and there's a documentary and a film made about it as well. When he was put on trial, he showed no remorse, he showed no emotional response, and all the way through his trial, the only thing that he ever said, if you want to highlight this, is, I was doing my job. I was following orders. So he said that he was just doing what he was told. He argued that he was not a cruel person. He was not an evil person. He was a father. He was a husband. He argued, I was just following orders, just doing what I was told to do. And he argued that that submission to authority was trapping of the situation. They were all just following orders from a perceived higher authority figure. And that filtered down into the soldiers as well, okay? So they were just forced to serve. We've also got Lieutenant William Calley, who was a former army officer in Vietnam War. So he was charged with mass murder of 504 unarmed people in My Lai. Now, Calley had told his soldiers, his men, to murder the villagers in defiance of the rules, okay? Even though they weren't actually posing any threat, okay? And as you can see in the booklet, his defense, much like Eichmann was, I was ordered, I was told to go in there, and my mission was to destroy the enemy. I did not sit down and I didn't think about the families and the women and the children that were being murdered. I did as I was told to do. I acted as I was directed, and I carried out the orders that I was given. And in that sense, as it says, I feel no wrong in what I did. So these real life war atrocities are often used to show the power of the situation. Okay. Both of those men are members of a military organisation who have a senior official who is giving orders to them. Are they evil? Probably not. Were they following orders from a legitimate authority figure? Were they trapped in the situation? Absolutely. So this not only means that there's valid experimental evidence, but there's valid real life evidence, meaning that the situational explanations are clearly truthful and accurate explanations of obedience. However, and there's always a but, they are considered to be incomplete because they don't explain everyone. They can't explain everyone. So what we use as evidence of this is why in Milgram's experiment, if everybody was trapped in the same situation with the same instruction, with the same experimenter, with the same white lab coat, how did 35% of them remove themselves from that situation? Okay. All participants were exposed to the same legitimate authority, and they all had experienced the same agentic shift, according to Milgram. But only 65% of them went to 450 volts. So therefore, there must be something else that has allowed them to withdraw, or alternatively, there must have been something else about the individuals who did go to the 450 volts. So this means legitimacy and agency are not necessarily complete pictures of human obedience. Now that's the the evaluation of Milgram's explanation, so the situational explanation. Flip forward, please, to page 35, and we're going to take a look now at the evaluation points for the authoritarian personality. So much like with Milgram, there is some experimental evidence. Now, interestingly, Milgram himself provides evidence for the personality playing a role in obedience. So he wanted obviously to test whether or not situation was the only powerful variable causing an impact. So what he did is he conducted a follow-up study. The study involved 40 participants who had previously took part in one of his experiments, 20 of which had gone up to the 450 volts and they were classed as the obedient people, and another 20 who hadn't and they were classed as defiants. Each of them then completed the F scale and they were interviewed about their childhood and their feelings towards the experimenter giving the orders. Out of the two groups, the ones that were classed as obedient, when they did the F scale, they showed higher levels of authoritarianism and they had more admiration for the experimenter. So that therefore suggests to us that there is something about those people who are obedient, and it might be that they've got that authoritarian personality. It's not a coincidence that more people who have the authoritarian personality are more likely to go to the full 450 volts in Milgram's research. However, there are elements of that research study that challenge the original theory. And this is because when the participants were asked what their childhood was like, several of them said that they had a good relationship with their parents. And no, sir, I haven't had a strict upbringing. No, sir, my parents didn't use physical punishment with me. So, therefore, that element of the authoritarian personality does not appear to be supported by experimental evidence. Yes, we can say that those with authoritarian personality are more likely to be obedient in that situation, but we can't go as far as saying that that is a result of the childhood that they have had, okay? So there's bits of it that are incomplete, okay? Bits of it that don't quite make sense. Furthermore, the dispositional explanation is also incomplete. If the situational explanation is incomplete because 35% of people resisted the order to go to 450 volts, then the dispositional explanation is also incomplete. It can't explain everybody. Now, what we use here to illustrate this point is again the Holocaust. Now, most German citizens and most Nazi soldiers did obey the orders of their government at that time to persecute and kill millions of Jewish people. It is highly improbable that all of those people had an authoritarian personality. So, what is it in that situation that has caused them to do it? We've got to recognise as well that for some acts of obedience, there is a fear of the consequences. It might not be the situation, it might not be the personality, it might genuinely be fear of what will happen to you if you don't follow that order. So you might want to add that on just at the bottom of page 36, okay? So that concludes the explanations of obedience. When you come in after half term, we're going to look at a consolidation question, a big 16 marker, but we're going to plan it together. So I'm hoping that you come in after half term with kind of knowledge of this material. But what you just need to do now as next steps, and it won't take you very long, I don't think, is do questions 2 and 3 in your social influence question packs. That's obviously the obedience section. And then attached to this assignment, there is an essay plan, a gapped essay plan, because I think you like those, which is discuss explanations of authority for 16 marks. Think about whether you could try some of the extension tasks included on there. Okay, right, thank you for listening to this video, guys. Hopefully, like I say, after half term, you can come in with some good knowledge of those explanations now. Okay, thank you.